Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that's been keeping humanity wired, paranoid, and occasionally productive for over a century: speed. Not the kind that gets you a ticket on the highway. I'm talking about amphetamines, the little pills that powered wars, built empires, and convinced more than a few people that reorganizing their sock drawer at 3 a.m. was a genius idea. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a massive thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. Your idea helped shape tonight's journey, and I'm genuinely grateful. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Somehow it's always 2 a.m. somewhere, and honestly that feels appropriate for this topic. Also, exciting news. We're now live on Spotify. You'll find the link in the description if you want to listen there. Now dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe hide your credit card so you don't accidentally buy a vintage typewriter you'll never use. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it's like to not sleep for 5 days straight and think it's fine? Or how an entire military could march for weeks fueled by nothing but tiny pills and misplaced confidence? What happens when a housewife in the 1950s takes her diet pills and suddenly deep cleans the entire neighborhood? Could you handle the come down, the crash where your brain feels like it's been replaced with wet cotton and existential dread? Would you last a day in the Third Reich's Blitzkrieg where soldiers weren't just following orders but chemically incapable of stopping? And here's the real question. If you had access to unlimited energy in a pill, would you take it, knowing what comes after? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in 1887. You're in a German laboratory. There's a chemist named Lazar Edelianu hunched over glassware, and he's just synthesized something new, phenylisopropylamine, later known as amphetamine. He has no idea what he's created. Nobody does yet. But this little molecule is about to change warfare, medicine, culture, and the inside of a lot of people's skulls. Good luck. Let's start at the very beginning. Back when nobody was trying to invent speed, they were just trying to cure asthma. In 1887, Romanian chemist Lazar Edelianu was tinkering with chemicals in a Berlin lab, synthesizing derivatives of ephedrine, a stimulant found in the ephedra plant. What he created was phenylisopropylamine, which would later be called amphetamine. At the time, he published his findings, shrugged, and moved on. Nobody cared. It sat on a shelf for decades like a chemical wallflower at a very boring party. But this wasn't just any molecule, it was a tiny key to the brain's reward system, and once humanity figured out how to turn that key, there was no going back. Edelianu had no idea what he'd made. He was focused on respiratory issues, trying to find compounds that could open airways and help people breathe easier. The late 19th century was obsessed with respiratory medicine. Tuberculosis was killing people by the thousands. Asthma was poorly understood, and any chemical that might help lungs function better was worth investigating. So when Edelianu synthesized this new compound, he noted its structure, recorded its properties, and filed it away. It didn't seem particularly useful for asthma. It didn't do much of anything obvious, so it was forgotten. But here's the thing about scientific discoveries. Sometimes the most dangerous ones are the quiet ones, the ones that don't announce themselves with explosions or immediate breakthroughs. Amphetamine sat dormant in the literature for nearly 40 years, waiting. Occasionally, a researcher would stumble across Edelianu's paper, glance at the molecular structure, and move on. There were more exciting things to study: radium, X-rays, the mysteries of the atom. A simple stimulant derivative wasn't worth anyone's time. What nobody realized, what they couldn't have realized, was that this molecule had a particular talent. It was small enough to cross the blood-brain barrier easily. Once inside the brain, it didn't just sit there politely. It hijacked the neurotransmitter systems responsible for alertness, pleasure, and motivation. It told the brain to release dopamine, norepinephrine and serotonin all at once, creating a cascade of effects that made people feel awake, focused, confident, and unstoppable. It was like finding a cheat code to human consciousness. But in 1887, nobody knew that yet. The scientific community of the time was more interested in opiates, cocaine, and other substances that had obvious, immediate effects. Morphine was being used widely in medicine. Cocaine was being added to everything from tonics to Coca-Cola. Compared to those dramatic substances, amphetamine seemed boring. It didn't produce euphoria like morphine. It didn't numb pain like cocaine. It just made you feel awake, alert, like you'd had a really good night's sleep and 3 cups of coffee. Hardly the stuff of scientific breakthroughs, but that underestimation would turn out to be catastrophic. Because amphetamine wasn't flashy, it didn't raise immediate red flags. It seemed safe, practical, almost wholesome. And when it was finally rediscovered and brought to market decades later, that perception of safety would allow it to spread faster and wider than any drug in human history. Doctors would prescribe it without hesitation. Patients would take it without fear. And by the time anyone realized what they were dealing with, millions of people were already hooked. So there it sat on that dusty shelf in Berlin, a bottle of white powder with a long chemical name that nobody could pronounce, harmless, forgotten, waiting for someone to pick it up and realize what they'd found, that someone would come eventually. And when he did, the world would never be the same. Fast forward to 1927. An American chemist named Gordon Alice was also trying to treat asthma, because apparently that was the medical obsession of the early 20th century. He synthesized amphetamine again, independently, not knowing that Adderall had done the same thing 4 decades earlier. But Alice did something Adderall hadn't. He tested it on himself. Because ethics were more of a suggestion back then, and scientists regularly used their own bodies as laboratories. What happened next changed everything. Alice injected himself with 50 milligrams of amphetamine sulfate and waited. Within minutes, he felt different. His heart rate increased, his breathing deepened, his sinuses cleared. That was good. That was the goal. But there was something else, something unexpected. He felt alert, sharp, energized in a way that had nothing to do with his lungs. His mind was racing, thoughts coming faster and clearer than usual. He felt confident, almost euphoric. He wasn't tired anymore. He felt like he could work all night and enjoy every second of it. He took notes frantically, documenting every sensation. Increased heart rate, check. Elevated blood pressure, check. Dilated pupils, check. Enhanced mood and alertness, very much check. This wasn't just an asthma medication. This was something else entirely, something powerful, something that made you feel like a better version of yourself. Alice didn't fully understand the mechanism yet. Neuroscience was still in its infancy, but he knew he'd found something marketable. By 1932, Alice had partnered with the pharmaceutical company Smith, Kline & French. They branded the drug Benzedrine and packaged it in a sleek, portable inhaler designed for nasal congestion. The inhaler was a stroke of marketing genius. It looked medical, legitimate, safe. You cracked it open, took a deep sniff of the amphetamine-soaked cotton strip inside, and boom, your sinuses cleared and your entire day got better. The company marketed it as a decongestant, which it was, but they also quietly noted its stimulating effects, which was putting it mildly. The Benzedrine inhaler hit the market and became an instant success. Drugstores couldn't keep them in stock. People loved them. They bought them for colds, allergies, and sinus trouble. And then they kept buying them because, well, they made life more manageable. Suddenly you could work longer hours without feeling exhausted. You could power through boring tasks with focus and energy. You could lose weight because your appetite vanished. You could stay up late and still wake up ready to go. It was a miracle product. Nobody called it speed yet. Nobody called it a drug. It was medicine, sold over the counter, endorsed by doctors, and trusted by the public. The fact that people were getting high off their asthma inhalers didn't raise alarms, it raised profits. Smith, Klein and French weren't stupid. They knew what they had, and they knew that as long as they framed it as medicine, nobody would ask too many questions. But some people did notice the effects. College students started figuring out that you could crack open the inhaler, remove the cotton strip, soak it in coffee or soda, and drink the resulting mixture for an intense hours-long buzz. Truck drivers discovered that a few sniffs could keep them awake through long hauls. Night shift workers used them to stay alert. Artists and writers used them to fuel creative binges. Slowly, quietly, Benzedrine stopped being just a decongestant. It became America's first mass-market stimulant. And the best part? It was completely legal. You didn't need a prescription. You didn't need a doctor. You just walked into a pharmacy, bought an inhaler for pocket change, and walked out with a drug that would soon power a world war, reshape youth culture, and ruin millions of lives. But in 1932, nobody knew that yet. They just knew that Benzedrine made everything better, until it didn't. By the late 1930s, Benzedrine wasn't just for stuffy noses anymore. Doctors started prescribing it for everything: depression, narcolepsy, weight loss, chronic fatigue, and even to pep up housewives who seemed a bit too tired from doing all the housework men refused to help with. Pharmaceutical companies marketed it as a cure-all, a miracle in a pill. Got the blues? Take a Benny, can't focus? Benny. Want to lose weight? Benny. The medical community barely blinked. There were no controlled studies, no long-term research, and certainly no warnings about, addiction, psychosis, or the fact that your heart might explode. It was the American dream in pill form. Work harder, sleep less, look better, and never ask questions. The transformation was rapid and complete. Within just a few years, Benzedrine went from an asthma inhaler to a prescription tablet available in every pharmacy in America. Doctors prescribed it enthusiastically, often without much thought. Patient feeling sluggish? Benzedrine. Student struggling to concentrate? Benzedrine. Woman complaining about fatigue after taking care of 6 children, cooking 3 meals a day, and maintaining a spotless home? Definitely Benzedrine. The drug was seen as a benign pick-me-up, like a stronger version of coffee, harmless, helpful, modern. Pharmaceutical advertisements in medical journals were relentless. They showed smiling housewives, alert students, productive workers, all improved by the magic of amphetamines. One ad campaign featured a woman surrounded by children and housework with the tagline, "Helps her cope with the demands of modern life." Another showed a businessman at a desk with papers piled high, looking refreshed and focused after taking his dose. The message was clear. Life is exhausting, but Benzedrine makes it manageable. And wasn't that what everyone wanted? A way to keep up with the relentless demands of modern society without burning out? The weight loss market exploded. Amphetamines suppress appetite dramatically. You simply forget to eat. For women pressured to maintain a certain figure, this was a godsend. Diet pills containing amphetamines became wildly popular, marketed under cheerful names that obscured their actual contents. Women took them religiously, often multiple times a day, and the pounds melted off. They also became jittery, anxious and sleepless. But that was just a small price to pay for fitting into last season's dress, right? Doctors barely questioned any of this. In the 1930s and 40s, the medical establishment had a paternalistic, cavalier attitude toward pharmaceuticals. If a drug seemed to work and didn't kill people immediately, it was considered safe. Long-term studies weren't really a thing yet. The idea that a medication could be addictive or harmful over time was acknowledged in theory, but rarely investigated in practice. Besides, patients seemed happy. They came back asking for refills, which doctors interpreted as the drug working rather than as a warning sign of dependency. Meanwhile, pharmaceutical companies were making money hand over fist. Benzedrine sales skyrocketed. Smith, Klein and French expanded production, and competitors rushed to develop their own amphetamine products. Dexedrine hit the market, marketed as a smoother, more refined version of Benzedrine. Soon, there were dozens of brands, all promising energy, focus, and an easier life. The pills were cheap, widely available, and socially acceptable. Taking them wasn't seen as drug use. It was seen as responsible self-care, a way to meet your obligations without complaining. And nobody, not the doctors, not the patients, not the pharmaceutical executives counting their profits, stopped to ask the obvious question: what happens when you give millions of people unlimited access to a powerful stimulant with no warnings, no monitoring, and no understanding of the long-term consequences? The answer was coming. But in the late 1930s, everyone was too busy feeling productive, energized, and modern to notice the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. It didn't take long for word to spread beyond doctors' offices. By the 1940s, college students discovered that Benzedrine inhalers could be cracked open and the cotton inside soaked in coffee or cola for a potent, if disgusting, study aid. Suddenly, kids who could barely stay awake in lectures were powering through finals with chemical confidence. Universities didn't ban it. They didn't even notice at first. And when they did notice, the attitude was more, boys will be boys, then this might be a problem. Amphetamines became part of campus culture, traded in dorm rooms like contraband candy. The students called it cramming fuel. What they didn't call it was dangerous. The discovery happened organically, the way most drug culture innovations do, through experimentation and word of mouth. Someone, somewhere, probably a desperate pre-med student facing an organic chemistry exam, figured out that the Benzedrine inhaler wasn't just for sniffing. You could take it apart, pull out the cotton strip soaked in amphetamine, drop it in a cup of coffee, let it steep like the world's worst tea and drink the result. The taste was absolutely vile, bitter, chemical, medicinal, but the effect was undeniable. Within 30 minutes, you were wide awake, laser-focused, and ready to memorize an entire semester's worth of notes in one sitting. Word spread like wildfire through dormitories. By the early 1940s, Benzedrine use on college campuses was endemic. Students bought inhalers by the handful, stockpiling them before exam periods like they were hoarding ammunition. Some enterprising students even figured out how to extract the amphetamine more efficiently, creating crude pills or more concentrated solutions. Dorm rooms became makeshift chemistry labs, with students experimenting with dosages and delivery methods. It was all very scientific, or so they told themselves. The effects were exactly what overwhelmed, sleep-deprived students wanted. Amphetamines didn't just keep you awake. They made you feel capable, even brilliant. Concepts that had seemed impossible suddenly made sense. Pages of notes flew by. Essays wrote themselves. You could study for 12, 16, even 24 hours straight without feeling tired, without losing focus, without the crushing doubt that usually accompanied academic stress. For students facing the pressure of maintaining grades, securing scholarships, and proving themselves worthy of their expensive educations, Benzedrine felt like a lifeline. But there were side effects, even if students didn't recognize them as such. the jitteriness, the racing heart, the inability to sleep even after the exam was over, the paranoia that crept in after the second or third sleepless night, the creeping suspicion that your roommate was judging you or that the professor had it out for you. The crash that came days later, a wave of exhaustion and depression so profound that getting out of bed felt impossible. Students attributed these symptoms to stress, to overwork, to the natural demands of college life. It never occurred to most of them that the pills were the problem, not the solution. Universities, for their part, were remarkably unconcerned. Benzedrine was legal, widely available, and medically accepted. If students were using it to study harder, wasn't that just ambition? Wasn't that what college was supposed to be about? Pushing yourself to your limits? Some professors even joked about it, making offhand comments about exam fuel, or asking students with particularly glazed manic expressions if they'd visited the pharmacy recently. It was treated as a rite of passage, a harmless quirk of academic culture. What nobody acknowledged was the precedent being set. An entire generation of students was learning that success required chemical assistance, that natural limits were meant to be overridden, that sleep and rest were obstacles rather than necessities. They were learning to distrust their own bodies and to rely on external substances to meet external demands. This mindset would follow them into their professional lives, into their families, into the next generation they raised. The college cramming culture of the 1940s wasn't just a phase. It was the beginning of America's long, toxic relationship with productivity drugs, and it all started with a cracked-open inhaler and a cup of truly terrible coffee. But the real turning point came with war. And not just any war, World War II, the most industrialized, mechanized, sleep-deprived conflict in human history. Armies on all sides quickly realized that tired soldiers don't fight well, but soldiers on speed? They're unstoppable, at least for a while. The American military issued Benzedrine tablets to troops, especially pilots flying long missions over the Pacific. The British gave out millions of pills to their forces. The Japanese had their own version called Philipon. And the Germans, well, they went all in with something called Pervitin. Speed wasn't just part of the war effort, it was fueling it, literally. Soldiers marched longer, pilots stayed alert for marathon flights, and nobody asked what happened when the pills ran out. World War II was unlike any previous conflict. It demanded constant vigilance, endless marching, and the ability to function under conditions of extreme physical and mental stress for days or even weeks at a time. Sleep was a luxury no army could afford. Commanders needed soldiers who could march all night, fight all day, and do it again the next day without collapsing. Traditional solutions, coffee, willpower, adrenaline, only went so far. What they needed was something stronger, something that could override the body's natural need for rest. They needed amphetamines. The United States military began distributing Benzedrine tablets to servicemen in 1942. The pills were small, white and innocuous looking, stamped with the manufacturer's logo. Pilots received them most frequently, especially those flying long bomber missions over the Pacific or night raids over Europe. A mission could last 8, 10, even 12 hours, and pilots had to remain sharp the entire time. One moment of inattention could mean death for the entire crew. Benzedrine kept them alert, focused, and capable of making split-second decisions even after hours in a cramped, freezing cockpit. But it wasn't just pilots. Infantry soldiers received Benzedrine too, particularly those involved in sustained combat operations. The island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific were brutal, bloody marathons where soldiers fought in sweltering jungles for days on end with little rest. Benzedrine helped them keep going when their bodies were screaming to stop. Medics carried the pills alongside morphine and bandages, distributing them as casually as they distributed ammunition, take two, stay alert, keep fighting. It was that simple. The British were even more enthusiastic. British forces consumed an estimated 72 million amphetamine tablets during the war. The RAF issued them to pilots as standard equipment. Bomber crews flying nighttime raids over Germany would take their pills before takeoff, knowing they'd need every ounce of alertness to navigate through flak, searchlights, and enemy fighters. The pills worked. Mission success rates improved. Fewer pilots fell asleep at the controls. Fewer planes were lost to pilot error. From a military perspective, amphetamines were a triumph. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces were using their own version, Philopon, a methamphetamine variant. Kamikaze pilots were rumoured to take massive doses before their final flights, not to make them suicidal, but to make them fearless, to override the natural human instinct for self-preservation. Whether that's true or propaganda is hard to say, but what's certain is that Japanese soldiers and factory workers alike used Philopon extensively throughout the war. It kept munitions workers awake through endless shifts. It kept soldiers fighting even when exhaustion should have rendered them combat ineffective. The military didn't see any problem with this. Amphetamines were just another tool, like a rifle or a radio. They improved performance, reduced casualties, and helped win battles. The fact that soldiers were becoming dependent on them, that they couldn't function without the pills, that they were developing severe psychological issues, none of that mattered in the context of total war. Victory was the only goal, and if speed helped achieve it, then speed was good. The long-term consequences could wait until after the war, and by then it would be too late. Millions of men had been introduced to amphetamines. Many would never stop using them. Let's talk about Nazi Germany's relationship with amphetamines, because it was intense, widespread, and deeply disturbing. In 1938, the German pharmaceutical company Temmler introduced Pervitin, a methamphetamine pill marketed to the public as a performance enhancer and mood lifter. It was available over the counter. Housewives took it, workers took it, students took it. Then the military got involved. By 1940, Pervitin was standard issue for Wehrmacht soldiers. More than 35 million tablets were distributed to troops during the early years of the war. The Blitzkrieg, the lightning-fast invasions that shocked Europe, wasn't just tactical genius, it was chemically assisted. Soldiers marched for days without sleep, their exhaustion masked by waves of artificial energy. They weren't superhuman, they were just high. The story of Pervitin begins innocently enough, at least on the surface. In the mid-1930s, German chemists were experimenting with methamphetamine, a more potent cousin of amphetamine. When Temmler Pharmaceuticals synthesized it successfully, they marketed it as a miracle drug for modern life. The advertising was slick and appealing. Pervitin would help you work longer, think clearer, and feel happier. It came in small tablets, easy to swallow, easy to carry. Housewives used it to manage their households more efficiently. Factory workers used it to power through grueling shifts. Students used it to study late into the night. It was seen as a productivity aid, a way to meet the demands of an increasingly fast-paced society. But when the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, got their hands on Pervitin, everything changed. Military doctors quickly recognized its potential. Soldiers who took Pervitin could march for extraordinarily long distances without rest. They could stay alert during night operations. They could fight through pain and exhaustion that would normally incapacitate a human being. For a military leadership planning rapid, overwhelming invasions, this was invaluable. Pervitin wasn't just useful, it was strategic. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The invasion succeeded in just over a month, shocking the world with its speed and brutality. Then came the invasions of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands in May 1940. German forces moved so quickly that Allied armies couldn't react in time. They called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Tanks rolled through the Ardennes forest, which military strategists had considered impassable. Infantry units marched day and night without pause. Within 6 weeks, France had fallen. The world was stunned. What many didn't know at the time was that Pervitin played a crucial role. Wehrmacht soldiers were issued tablets routinely, sometimes several times a day. They took them before marches, before battles, during long watches. The pills allowed them to function far beyond normal human limits. Soldiers later described feeling invincible, tireless, capable of anything. They didn't feel hunger, fatigue, or fear. They just felt unstoppable, and for a while, they were. But there were consequences, even early on. Soldiers began exhibiting strange behaviours. Some became paranoid, convinced their comrades were plotting against them. Others experienced hallucinations, seeing enemies that weren't there or hearing voices in the night. Aggression spiked. Soldiers would snap over minor disagreements, sometimes violently. Medical officers began documenting these side effects, but were overruled by commanders who cared more about combat effectiveness than mental health. By 1941, the problems were undeniable. Soldiers who had been taking Pervitin for months were collapsing from exhaustion the moment the pills wore off. Some suffered heart attacks. Others developed severe psychological issues, what we'd now recognize as stimulant-induced psychosis. The Wehrmacht began to scale back distribution, issuing guidelines about proper dosing and limiting access. But it was too late. Entire divisions were dependent. Soldiers who didn't get their pills couldn't function. They were lethargic, depressed, unable to focus. The German military had created an army of addicts, and the civilian population wasn't much better off. Pervitin had been sold over the counter for years, and millions of Germans were using it regularly. Housewives, workers, students, all caught in the same trap. By the time the government tried to regulate it in 1941, restricting it to prescription only, the damage was done. An entire nation had been running on synthetic energy, and now the bill was coming due. The Blitzkrieg had worked. Germany had conquered most of Europe. But the soldiers who achieved those victories weren't heroes. They were casualties of a different kind of warfare, one waged against their own biology. Pervitin didn't create the Nazi war machine, but it certainly lubricated it, allowing ordinary men to commit extraordinary violence without the natural breaks of fatigue, doubt, or humanity. And when the war finally ended, those men carried the scars, both physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. Here's the part the military didn't advertise: the crash. Amphetamines don't give you energy, they just borrow it from your future self, with interest. After days of marching, fighting and functioning on no sleep and a handful of pills, soldiers would hit a wall, and it wasn't a gentle wall, it was a collapse. Paranoia, hallucinations, aggression, psychosis, heart failure. Some soldiers reported seeing things that weren't there, attacking their own comrades, or simply shutting down mid-battle, unable to move. The German military started noticing the side effects by 1941 and tried to scale back distribution, but by then it was too late. Entire divisions were dependent, and the human cost, buried in classified reports and conveniently forgotten after the war. The crash wasn't immediate, that was part of the problem. Soldiers could take Pervitin or Benzedrine for days, even weeks, riding the chemical wave of artificial alertness. They'd march through the night, fight during the day, take another pill, and keep going. Their bodies were screaming for rest, but the amphetamines overrode every signal. Hunger disappeared. Fatigue vanished. Pain became distant and manageable. They felt invincible. Until they didn't. The first sign was usually confusion. A soldier who had been sharp and focused would suddenly seem disoriented, unable to follow simple commands. He'd stare blankly when spoken to, his eyes glassy and unfocused. Then came the paranoia. He'd become convinced that his squad mates were plotting against him, that the enemy was hiding in shadows that didn't exist, that headquarters had betrayed them all. Some soldiers would refuse to sleep even when given the chance, convinced that closing their eyes would get them killed. The drug had rewired their ability to distinguish real threats from imagined ones. Hallucinations were common. Visual, auditory, tactile, all of it. Soldiers saw enemy soldiers that weren't there and fired at shadows. They heard voices calling their names, giving orders that no one had actually issued. Some felt insects crawling under their skin and scratched themselves bloody trying to dig them out. Medical officers documented cases of soldiers who became convinced they were being pursued by monsters, by ghosts, by abstract concepts of death itself. The line between reality and delusion had dissolved entirely. Aggression was another major problem. Amphetamines don't just make you alert, they make you irritable, short-tempered, prone to explosive violence over minor provocations. A soldier bumped by a comrade might suddenly attack him with fists or weapons. Arguments over rations or sleeping positions could escalate into fights that left men seriously injured or dead. Officers reported that some units, particularly those with heavy Pervitin use, were more dangerous to themselves than to the enemy. Discipline broke down. Violence became random and unpredictable. And then there was the physical collapse. When a soldier finally stopped taking the pills, whether by choice, by running out of supply, or by medical intervention, his body simply gave up. He'd sleep for days straight, sometimes longer. When he woke, he was a shell, profoundly depressed, unable to muster energy or motivation, plagued by nightmares and crippling anxiety. His heart might be damaged from months of racing at unsafe speeds. His brain chemistry was scrambled. He couldn't eat, couldn't think, couldn't function. Recovery took weeks or months, if it happened at all. The German military documented all of this in internal reports, which were kept classified for decades. They noted that Pervitin was causing more casualties than they'd anticipated, not battle casualties, but psychological and medical ones. Soldiers were being sent home not because they were wounded, but because they were insane. Hospital wards filled with men who'd been broken not by bullets, but by pills. The Wehrmacht tried to implement guidelines, lower doses, mandatory rest periods, medical oversight. But enforcing those guidelines in the chaos of war was impossible. The Allies had similar problems, though perhaps not on the same scale. American and British forces also experienced crashes, psychosis, and dependency among soldiers using Benzedrine. But those militaries were better at keeping it quiet, at attributing the problems to combat stress rather than drug use. After the war, very few veterans talked about it. The ones who did were often dismissed as shell-shocked or exaggerating. The official histories rarely mentioned amphetamines at all, so the human cost of speed in World War II remained hidden for generations. Thousands of men, possibly hundreds of thousands, suffered lasting psychological and physical damage from drugs their own governments had given them. They came home broken in ways their families couldn't understand. They struggled with addiction, depression, paranoia, and rage. Many self-medicated with alcohol or more amphetamines, creating cycles of abuse that destroyed their post-war lives, and almost nobody connected it back to those little white pills they'd taken so casually during the war. The crash was real. It was devastating, and for decades it was a secret. When World War II ended, millions of soldiers came home, and many of them brought something back with them, a taste for amphetamines. The pills that had kept them alert in the Pacific or over Europe were still available, rebranded for civilian life. Pharmaceutical companies didn't miss a beat. Benzedrine, Dexedrine, and other amphetamine brands flooded the market, prescribed for weight loss, depression, fatigue, and basically anything that made you feel less than perfect. Doctors handed them out like candy. Housewives, truckers, students, and businessmen all became regular users. America in the 1950s wasn't just optimistic, it was wired. The transition from military to civilian use was seamless, almost disturbingly so. Pharmaceutical companies had made enormous profits supplying the war effort, and they weren't about to let that revenue stream dry up just because peace had broken out. So they pivoted. Amphetamines that had been marketed to soldiers as alertness aids were now marketed to civilians as lifestyle enhancers. Same drug, different pitch. And it worked beautifully. Returning veterans were an obvious market. Many had been taking Benzedrine regularly during the war and had grown dependent on it. They came home to a country that expected them to immediately reintegrate, find jobs, start families, and act like the horrors they had witnessed hadn't happened. That was a tall order. Some veterans turned to alcohol. Others turned to the pills they'd grown familiar with overseas. Benzedrine helped them stay functional, helped them suppress the memories and the nightmares, helped them meet the demands of civilian life without falling apart. At least that's what they told themselves. But the real explosion in civilian amphetamine use came from people who'd never served at all. Doctors in the late 1940s and throughout the 50s prescribed amphetamines for an astonishing array of complaints. Feeling tired? Amphetamines? Feeling sad? Amphetamines? Want to lose a few pounds? Amphetamines? Can't concentrate? Amphetamines? Having trouble getting out of bed in the morning? You guessed it, amphetamines. The medical establishment had decided that these pills were safe, effective, and appropriate for almost any situation involving low energy or mood. The result was predictable. By the mid-1950s, Americans were consuming hundreds of millions of amphetamine pills every year. Prescription rates skyrocketed. Pharmacies couldn't keep them in stock. And because they were legal, prescribed by doctors, and endorsed by pharmaceutical companies with slick advertising campaigns, nobody thought of them as drugs. They were medicine. They were help. They were modern science making life easier. This was the era of better living through chemistry, the widespread belief that science could solve any problem, including the problem of being human. Tired? That's a medical condition. Take a pill. Sad? That's a medical condition. Take a pill. Hungry? That's a problem that interferes with looking good. Take a pill. The idea that maybe people were tired because they were working too hard, or sad because their lives were unfulfilling, or hungry because that's what human bodies do, those ideas were dismissed as old-fashioned. Modern people didn't suffer. They medicated. Pharmaceutical advertising drove this mentality hard. Magazine ads showed smiling, energetic people conquering their days with the help of their daily pill. Doctor-targeted ads in medical journals positioned amphetamines as essential tools for patient care, subtly suggesting that not prescribing them was a failure to help. The message was clear and constant. Life is hard, but amphetamines make it manageable, and millions of Americans believed it. What nobody talked about, what almost nobody even noticed, was the addiction. People didn't think they were addicted because addiction was something that happened to weak people, to moral failures, to criminals shooting heroin in alleyways. Addiction didn't happen to housewives taking diet pills prescribed by their family doctor. It didn't happen to businessmen taking Benzedrine to stay sharp during long work days. It didn't happen to students cramming for exams with Benzedrine. Those were just people using medicine as intended. But the signs were there. People couldn't function without their pills. They panicked when prescriptions ran low. They went to multiple doctors to get more pills when one doctor cut them off. They experienced withdrawal, crushing fatigue, depression, inability to feel pleasure whenever they tried to stop. They developed tolerance, needing higher and higher doses to achieve the same effect. They exhibited all the classic signs of dependency, But because the drugs were legal and medical, nobody called it what it was. America in the 1950s looked shiny and prosperous on the surface. Suburban homes, new cars, booming economy, optimistic future. But underneath, millions of people were running on fumes and pharmaceuticals, artificially propped up by speed, unable to stop even if they'd wanted to. The post-war pill problem wasn't an anomaly or an accident. It was the inevitable result of putting profit over safety, convenience over health, and short-term solutions over long-term consequences. And it was only just beginning. If you were a woman in post-war America, society expected you to be June Cleaver, perfectly coiffed, cheerful, tireless, and never, ever resentful of doing all the unpaid labour while your husband read the newspaper. Unsurprisingly, many women struggled with this. Enter amphetamines, marketed specifically to women as diet pills or energy boosters. Ads showed smiling housewives with sparkling kitchens, all thanks to their daily dose of Benzedrine. What the ads didn't show, the insomnia, the irritability, the addiction, or the slow unravelling that happened when the prescription ran out. These weren't just pills, they were chemical permission slips to keep going when your body and mind were screaming for rest. The 1950s housewife lived in a paradox. She was told she had it made: a nice house, modern appliances, a working husband, healthy children. What more could she want? But the reality was exhausting. She cooked 3 meals a day from scratch. She cleaned the house constantly. She did endless loads of laundry without the benefit of modern machines that actually worked well. She managed the children's schedules, maintained a social calendar, and was expected to look immaculate while doing it all. And if she felt tired, overwhelmed, or unhappy about any of this, she was told something was wrong with her. Normal women were supposed to find fulfillment in domesticity. So when her doctor suggested a little pill to help with her energy levels, it seemed like the perfect solution. Dexedrine, Benzedrine, or any of dozens of other amphetamine brands. Take one in the morning, and suddenly the endless tasks didn't seem so overwhelming. The dishes got done faster, the house got cleaner, the children seemed less annoying. She could smile through the monotony because the pill made everything feel manageable, even enjoyable. The weight loss angle was particularly effective. Most diet pills in the 1950s and 60s were just amphetamines with different names. Albuterol, Desoxin, Preludin. The market was flooded with them, and they worked, at least initially. Amphetamines kill your appetite completely. You forget to eat. You don't feel hungry. The pounds drop off effortlessly. For women under constant pressure to maintain a certain figure, this was miraculous. Finally, a way to stay thin without the suffering of traditional dieting. But the cost was steep. The pills made sleep difficult, so women lay awake at night, their minds racing, unable to shut off. They became irritable, snapping at their children and husbands over minor annoyances. Their hands trembled, their hearts raced. They developed anxiety, a constant low-level panic that something was wrong, but they couldn't identify what. When they tried to stop taking the pills, even for a day, the exhaustion was crushing. They'd sleep for 12 hours and wake up feeling worse than before. So they took another pill, and another, and another. Dependency developed quickly, but because the pills were prescribed by doctors and taken for medical reasons, women didn't recognize it as addiction. They just knew they couldn't function without them. They'd call their doctor begging for a refill, claiming they'd lost their prescription, or that it wasn't working as well and they needed a higher dose. Doctors, for the most part, complied without question. A woman asking for diet pills or energy medication wasn't a red flag, it was normal. The social isolation made things worse. Housewives weren't supposed to complain. They certainly weren't supposed to admit that they needed drugs just to get through the day. So they suffered in silence. popping pills in their pristine kitchens, maintaining the facade of the perfect suburban life while slowly unravelling inside. Some developed full-blown psychosis, becoming paranoid and delusional. Others experienced severe depression when they finally tried to quit. A few died, heart attacks, overdoses, suicides. But those deaths were rarely attributed to the pills. They were just tragic accidents, unexplained medical events, or breakdowns blamed on female fragility. The pharmaceutical companies knew exactly what they were doing. Internal documents from the era show they specifically targeted women in their marketing, understanding that housewives represented a massive untapped market. They crafted ads that spoke directly to women's insecurities and exhaustions, positioning amphetamines as the solution to the impossible standards society imposed. And it worked. By the early 1960s, it's estimated that millions of American women were taking amphetamines regularly, many of them completely unaware that they were addicted to speed. The cultural narrative around these pills was insidious. They weren't portrayed as drugs that helped women escape reality. They were portrayed as drugs that helped women fulfill their duties. They weren't about getting high. They were about being a better wife and mother. The message was clear. If you can't handle your responsibilities on your own, there's something wrong with you. But don't worry, there's a pill for that. Take it, smile, and get back to work. And don't you dare complain. While housewives cleaned, truckers drove. Long-haul trucking in the 1950s and 60s meant covering thousands of miles on tight deadlines, often alone, with nothing but the radio and the highway for company. Enter amphetamines, affectionately called co-pilots, or West Coast turnarounds. Truckers would pop a few pills and drive straight through the night, sometimes for days, delivering goods across the country without stopping. It was effective until it wasn't. Crashes, both the vehicular kind and the human kind, skyrocketed. Some drivers reported hallucinations, phantom hitchhikers, animals in the road that weren't there, entire conversations with people who didn't exist. The highway became a fever dream, and speed was the ticket. The trucking industry in mid-century America was brutal. Drivers were paid by the mile, not by the hour, which meant the faster you drove and the fewer stops you made, the more money you earned. Competition was fierce. Shipping companies demanded impossible schedules. A load needed to go from Los Angeles to New York in 3 days? Fine. That meant non-stop driving, minimal sleep and maximum speed. Drivers who couldn't meet deadlines didn't get hired again. It was that simple. So truckers turned to amphetamines. Benzedrine and Dexedrine were easy to get with a prescription, and plenty of doctors catering to truckers were happy to write those prescriptions, no questions asked. Some truck stops even sold the pills under the counter, alongside coffee and cigarettes. It was an open secret. Everyone knew truckers used speed. It was just part of the job, like checking your oil or adjusting your mirrors. The pills worked exactly as advertised. A trucker could take a handful of Benzedrine and drive for 24, 36, even 48 hours straight. He didn't feel tired. His focus stayed sharp, or so it seemed. The miles disappeared beneath his wheels. He made his deadline, got paid, and took another job. The system rewarded this behaviour. The faster you drove, the more load you hauled, the better off you were financially. And amphetamines made that possible. But the side effects were catastrophic. After a certain point, usually around the 40-hour mark without sleep, reality started to fracture. Truckers reported seeing things that weren't there. The classic hallucination was the phantom hitchhiker. A figure standing by the side of the road, sometimes waving, sometimes just standing there. The driver would slow down, thinking someone needed help, only to realise as he got closer that there was nobody there. Some drivers saw entire towns that didn't exist, pulling off the highway to stop for gas at stations that vanished when they approached. Animals were another common hallucination. Deer, dogs, people darting into the road. Truckers would slam on the brakes, swerving wildly to avoid obstacles that weren't real, sometimes causing actual accidents in the process. Some reported conversations with passengers who weren't in the cab, carrying on detailed discussions with invisible co-pilots who gave directions or told stories. When the hallucinations got bad enough, some drivers simply couldn't tell what was real anymore. Crashes became inevitable. Sometimes it was because the driver hallucinated an obstacle and swerved off the road. Sometimes it was because he fell asleep at the wheel the moment the pills wore off, his body shutting down instantly after days of abuse. Sometimes it was because the amphetamines made him reckless, driving too fast, taking curves too hard, convinced he was invincible. Highways across the country saw an increase in trucking accidents, many of them fatal. Investigators would find bottles of pills in the wreckage, but nobody wanted to talk about it. The trucking industry certainly didn't. It was cheaper to lose a few drivers than to change the entire system. The toll on drivers who didn't crash was almost as bad. Chronic amphetamine use destroyed their health. Heart problems, high blood pressure, strokes. Truckers were dying young, worn out by the combination of speed, stress, and sleeplessness. Their relationships fell apart. Many became addicted, unable to drive without pills, unable to sleep without alcohol or sedatives to counteract the stimulants. Their lives became a chemical seesaw, uppers to go, downers to stop, and no baseline in between. Some drivers tried to quit. They'd swear off the pills, determined to do things the right way. But the economics of trucking made that nearly impossible. Without amphetamines, they couldn't make the deadlines. Without meeting deadlines, they didn't get paid. Without pay, they couldn't feed their families. So they'd go back to the pills, telling themselves it was just temporary, just until things got better. But things never got better. The cycle continued, grinding them down mile by mile, pill by pill, until they crashed, literally or figuratively. The highway culture of the 1950s and 60s romanticized this lifestyle. Songs were written about truckers, celebrating their independence and toughness. Movies portrayed them as modern cowboys, masters of the road. But the reality was far darker. Men destroying themselves to meet impossible demands, propped up by amphetamines and desperation, hallucinating their way across the country, while the industry that employed them looked the other way and counted its profits. The co-pilot wasn't helping, it was slowly killing the driver. Meanwhile, in the underground, artists and writers were discovering amphetamines for entirely different reasons. The Beat Generation, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs used Benzedrine as creative fuel. Kerouac famously typed the first draft of On the Road in 3 weeks, on a continuous scroll of paper, fueled by coffee and Benzedrine. The pills didn't make them talented, but they did remove the brakes, allowing them to write, create, and think at a pace that felt almost supernatural. Of course, the work was often rambling, unedited, and manic, but it was also raw, urgent, and undeniably influential. Speed didn't create the counterculture, but it certainly accelerated it. The beat writers weren't using amphetamines to meet deadlines or stay awake at work. They were using them to break through the constraints of conventional thinking, to push past the boundaries of normal consciousness, to achieve a state of creative flow that felt transcendent. To them, Benzedrine wasn't a drug. It was a tool, a key that unlocked parts of the mind that were normally inaccessible. Jack Kerouac's relationship with Benzedrine is legendary. In April 1951, he sat down at his typewriter with a roll of tracing paper taped together into a continuous scroll. He'd done this so he wouldn't have to stop typing to change pages. Every interruption was a break in the flow, a loss of momentum. He took Benzedrine, drank endless cups of coffee, and typed for 3 weeks straight. The result was the first draft of On the Road, a novel that would define a generation. The prose was breathless, urgent, stream of consciousness, filled with jazz rhythms and spontaneous energy. It read like it had been written in one continuous burst of inspiration, because essentially it had been. Critics would later argue about whether the amphetamines improved or damaged his writing. The manuscript needed heavy editing before publication. It was repetitive, rambling, sometimes incoherent. But it also had an energy that carefully crafted prose often lacked. It felt alive, immediate, like you're inside Kerouac's head as he wrote. And that raw quality, that sense of unfiltered consciousness, became central to beat aesthetics. The goal wasn't polish, it was truth, even if that truth was messy and manic. Allen Ginsberg used Benzedrine too, though perhaps more sporadically than Kerouac. His most famous poem, Howl, has the same breathless, accelerated quality as Kerouac's prose. Long lines that cascade forward, piling image upon image, thought upon thought, barely stopping for breath. It's exhausting to read aloud, and that's the point. Ginsberg wanted to capture the frantic energy of modern life, the speed at which the world was moving and the way that speed was crushing the people caught in it. Amphetamines gave him the tempo he needed. William S. Burroughs, always the darkest and most experimental of the beats, saw amphetamines differently. He recognized them as dangerous, addictive, and destructive. He'd used them himself, along with every other drug he could get his hands on, and he understood the trap they represented. In his writing, speed was less about creativity and more about control, the way it could take over your life, dictate your rhythms, turn you into a slave to the next dose. His work was full of addicts, junkies, and people destroyed by their dependencies. He wasn't celebrating amphetamines, he was documenting their brutality. But even Burroughs couldn't deny that the drug had creative utility. It sharpened focus in a specific way, made connections that wouldn't normally happen, broke down the filters that usually governed thought and language. For artists willing to risk the downsides, amphetamines offered access to a certain kind of creative state, chaotic, uncontrolled, but undeniably productive. The broader beat community embraced this. Speed became part of the scene, passed around at parties and readings, used during all-night writing sessions and philosophical debates that lasted until dawn. It fit perfectly with their rejection of mainstream values. Society wanted them to slow down, get steady jobs, conform. Amphetamines let them do the opposite, move faster, think bigger, refuse to settle. It was rebellion in pill form. Of course, not everyone survived the experiment. Some beat writers and artists burned out spectacularly, destroyed by the same drugs they'd used to fuel their creativity. Neil Cassidy, the real-life inspiration for Dean Moriarty and On the Road, died at 41, his body wrecked by years of amphetamine abuse. Others faded into obscurity, their early promise consumed by addiction. The ones who survived, like Ginsberg, who eventually quit most drugs and turned to meditation and Buddhism, looked back on those years with mixed feelings. The work had been important, groundbreaking even, but the cost had been steep. Still, the influence lingered. The idea that amphetamines could unlock creativity, that drugs could be tools for expanding consciousness rather than just escapes from reality, became central to the counterculture of the 1960s. The Beats had shown that speed wasn't just for soldiers and truckers and housewives. It could be for artists, for rebels, for people trying to see the world differently. Whether that was genius or delusion depended on who you asked. But either way, the pills kept flowing and the typing kept going, one manic sentence after another. Cross the Atlantic to 1960s Britain, and you'll find another group of young people obsessed with speed. The mods. These were working-class kids who dressed sharp, rode scooters, and danced all night in clubs to soul and ska music. And to keep dancing all night, they took amphetamines, usually in the form of Purple Hearts, triangular tablets that became synonymous with mod culture. The pills kept them awake, energized and ready to fight their rivals, the rockers, in seaside brawls that became legendary. But the mods weren't just recreational users. Many were genuinely addicted, burning through their wages on pills just to keep up the lifestyle. The music was loud, the clothes were cool, but underneath, a generation was running on fumes. The mod movement emerged in London in the late 1950s, but it exploded into mainstream consciousness in the early 60s. Mods were obsessed with style, with looking perfect down to the smallest detail. Custom-tailored suits, slim-fit trousers, button-down shirts, desert boots or loafers, perfectly combed hair. The girls wore short skirts, bold makeup and geometric haircuts. Everything had to be just right. Image wasn't just important, it was everything. But maintaining that image required energy, and lots of it. Mods worked regular jobs during the week, office clerks, shop assistants, factory workers, and then transformed themselves on the weekends. Friday night, they'd change into their sharp clothes, hop on their Vespa or Lambretta scooters, and head to the clubs. They danced to American soul, Motown, ska, and early R&B until dawn, then kept going through Saturday and sometimes into Sunday. Sleep was for people without ambition. That's where the pills came in. Purple Hearts, officially called Drinamil, a combination of amphetamine and barbiturate, became the drug of choice. You could get them easily from dodgy doctors or dealers who hung around the clubs. The purple triangular tablets were small, easy to hide, and powerful. 1 or 2 would keep you going all night. 3 or 4 would keep you going all weekend. The amphetamine provided the energy and focus, while the barbiturate took the edge off, preventing the jitteriness that came from straight speed. The effect was perfect for the mod lifestyle. You felt alert, confident, sociable. The music sounded better. The dancing felt effortless. You could talk for hours, make new friends, feel like you were part of something important. The pills turned shy working-class kids into charismatic club-goers who owned the night. For a generation stuck in dead-end jobs with limited prospects, those weekends represented freedom, identity, and belonging. But Purple Hearts were just the beginning. As tolerance built, mods moved on to stronger amphetamines. Black Bombers, Durafet, became popular. These were pure amphetamine, no barbiturate to soften the impact. They hit harder and lasted longer. Some mods took handfuls at a time, staying awake for 3 or 4 days straight. The crash afterward was devastating, but that was a problem for Monday. The weekend was for living. The rivalry with the rockers, working-class kids who preferred leather jackets, motorcycles and rock and roll, added another dimension. The two groups despised each other on principle. Mods thought rockers were dirty and backward. Rockers thought mods were pretentious and effeminate. When they clashed, usually at seaside, towns like Brighton or Margate during holiday weekends, the fights were vicious. And amphetamines made them worse. Mods high on Purple Hearts or Black Bombers were aggressive, fearless, and unable to back down. What might have been minor scuffles turned into full-scale riots. The media sensationalized the violence, turning the mods and rockers into symbols of youth gone wrong. Behind the scenes, though, the real damage was quieter. Mods were burning through their paychecks buying pills. A weekend supply could cost as much as they earned in a week. Some started dealing just to fund their own habits. Others turned to petty crime. Relationships with families deteriorated. Parents couldn't understand why their sons and daughters were so exhausted during the week, so manic on the weekends, so secretive about where they went and what they did. Addiction crept in slowly. At first, the pills were just for weekends, just for fun. But then you needed them to get through a boring workday. Then you needed them just to feel normal. Then you needed them all the time. Some mods realised what was happening and tried to quit, only to discover that stopping meant crushing depression, overwhelming fatigue, and a complete inability to enjoy anything. Life without pills felt flat and colourless, so they kept taking them. By the mid-60s, the mod scene was fragmenting. Some moved on to other drugs, marijuana, LSD, eventually heroin. Others grew out of it, settling into adult life with jobs and families. But many were left damaged, struggling with addictions they developed as teenagers, unable to recapture the energy and excitement of those early years. The clothes and the scooters and the music had been fun, but the pills had been poison dressed up as freedom. The British government eventually cracked down, reclassifying amphetamines and making them harder to get. Doctors stopped prescribing them so freely. The Purple Heart supply dried up. But by then, a generation of working-class kids had learned that chemical enhancement was the only way to escape the monotony of their lives, even temporarily. The mod movement faded, but the lesson lingered. Speed could make you feel alive, at least until it killed you. Let's talk about American football in the 1960s and 70s, because it wasn't just tackling and touchdowns, it was pills. Amphetamines were rampant in the NFL, distributed by team doctors, trainers, and coaches who saw them as performance enhancers rather than drugs. Players called them greenies, and they were everywhere, in locker rooms, training camps, and even handed out before games. The logic was simple. Football is a brutal, exhausting sport, and players needed an edge to keep going through injuries, pain, and fatigue. So they took speed. Lots of it. The results? Players performed at superhuman levels until their bodies gave out. Heart problems, strokes, addiction, and early deaths followed many retired players. But for decades, nobody talked about it. It was just part of the game. The culture of amphetamine use in professional football started innocuously enough. In the early 60s, team doctors began offering players small pills before games, framing them as nothing more than pep pills or energy boosters. The pills were legal, prescribed by licensed physicians, and seemed harmless. Players were told the drugs would help them stay alert, improve their reaction times, and push through the exhaustion that came from playing a physically demanding sport at the highest level. Most players didn't ask questions. If the team doctor said it was okay, it must be okay. But these weren't mild stimulants. They were pharmaceutical-grade amphetamines, Dexedrine, Benzedrine, and similar compounds. And they did exactly what amphetamines do. They overrode the body's natural warning systems. Pain became distant and ignorable. Fatigue disappeared. Fear evaporated. Players felt invincible, capable of hitting harder, running faster, and playing through injuries that should have sent them to the hospital. It was a competitive advantage, and in a sport where the difference between making the team and getting cut could come down to a single game, players took every advantage they could get. The distribution was shockingly casual. Some teams kept bowls of greenies in the locker room, available for anyone who wanted them. Players would grab a handful before games, before practices, sometimes just because. It became part of the ritual, like taping ankles or reviewing plays. Veterans introduced rookies to the pills, framing it as essential knowledge. If you wanted to make it in the NFL, you took your greenies. It wasn't drug use, it was professionalism. Coaches and management knew exactly what was happening. Some actively encouraged it, seeing amphetamine use as a sign of toughness and dedication. A player who refused the pills might be viewed as soft, unwilling to do what it took to win. The unspoken message was clear. This is how the game is played. If you can't handle it, there's someone else who can. And with hundreds of college players waiting for a shot at the pros, no one wanted to be the guy who couldn't keep up. The on-field results were undeniable. Players on amphetamines were faster, more aggressive, more focused. They played through concussions that should have knocked them out of the game. They ignored broken bones and torn ligaments until after the final whistle. They delivered hits with a ferocity that thrilled fans and terrified opponents. The NFL in the 60s and 70s was defined by this intensity, this superhuman level of play. But it wasn't superhuman. It was chemical. The costs started showing up years later. Former players began dying young, heart attacks in their 40s and 50s, strokes, sudden cardiac arrests. Some developed severe psychiatric problems, paranoia, depression, violent mood swings. Many became addicted to amphetamines or other drugs, unable to function without chemical assistance. Their bodies, pushed beyond natural limits for years, simply broke down prematurely. Families noticed but didn't understand. Why was Dad so angry all the time? Why couldn't he sleep? Why did he have pills stashed all over the house? The players themselves often didn't connect their health problems to the greenies they'd taken during their careers. They'd been told the pills were safe, that everyone used them, that they were no different from taking aspirin. The idea that their team doctors and trainers had been systematically drugging them for competitive advantage was too disturbing to accept. The NFL's official stance was denial. When reports began surfacing in the 1970s about widespread amphetamine use, the league downplayed it. They claimed it was isolated incidents, a few bad actors, nothing systemic. Team doctors insisted they were only prescribing when medically necessary, even though everyone knew that was a lie. The league had no incentive to investigate too closely. The game was more popular than ever, generating billions in revenue. Why risk that by admitting you'd been running a decades-long doping program? It wasn't until the 1980s that amphetamine use in the NFL started to decline, and even then it was more because players moved on to other performance enhancers, steroids, human growth hormone, more sophisticated drugs with less obvious side effects. But the damage from the speed era lingered. An entire generation of players had been used as guinea pigs in an uncontrolled experiment, their health sacrificed for entertainment and profit. And the worst part? Most fans had no idea. They cheered for players who were destroying themselves, never knowing that the incredible performances they witnessed were fueled by drugs the league itself had provided. The dirty secret of the NFL wasn't just that amphetamines were used, it was that they were encouraged, normalized, and swept under the rug until it was too late to help the men who'd been harmed. And even today, with more awareness of the dangers of performance-enhancing drugs, the fundamental problem remains. Professional sports demand superhuman performance, and athletes will do whatever it takes to deliver, consequences be damned. The greenies are mostly gone, but the mentality that created them is still alive and well. By the mid-1960s, the scale of amphetamine use in America was staggering. Billions of pills were being manufactured every year, and it was becoming clear that this wasn't just a medical issue, it was a public health crisis. Reports of addiction, overdoses and psychosis were piling up. In 1970, the federal government finally stepped in, passing the Controlled Substances Act, which classified amphetamines as Schedule II drugs, legal for medical use but tightly regulated. Production quotas were slashed, prescriptions were scrutinized. For the first time, speed was treated as dangerous, but it was too late. Millions were already hooked, and the illegal market was just getting started. The wake-up call came from multiple directions at once. Emergency rooms were seeing increasing numbers of patients with amphetamine-induced psychosis, people who'd taken too much for too long and completely lost touch with reality. They were paranoid, hallucinating, violent, convinced that people were trying to kill them or that bugs were crawling under their skin. These weren't back-alley drug addicts. They were housewives, students, businessmen, regular people who'd been prescribed pills by their doctors and had spiraled out of control. addiction specialists began documenting the scope of the problem. Studies revealed that amphetamine dependence was far more common than anyone had realized. Millions of Americans were taking these pills daily, unable to function without them, exhibiting all the classic signs of addiction. They developed tolerance, requiring higher and higher doses to achieve the same effect. They experienced severe withdrawal when they tried to stop. Their lives had become organized around getting and taking pills. But because the drugs were legal and prescribed, most didn't think of themselves as addicts. Journalists started investigating, writing exposés about the pharmaceutical industry's role in creating and sustaining the crisis. They documented how drug companies had knowingly marketed amphetamines for non-medical uses, how they'd pressured doctors to prescribe them liberally, how they downplayed the addiction risks while maximizing profits. One investigation found that in 1969 alone, American pharmaceutical companies had produced enough amphetamine pills to give every man, woman, and child in the country about 25 tablets each. The numbers were obscene. Congress held hearings. Doctors testified about patients they couldn't help because the addiction was too severe. Parents testified about children who'd started taking diet pills as teenagers and were now, in their 20s, completely dependent. Law enforcement testified about the growing black market for diverted prescription amphetamines. The evidence was overwhelming. These drugs, once considered safe and beneficial, were destroying lives on a massive scale. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 was the government's response. It created a scheduling system for drugs based on their potential for abuse and medical utility. Amphetamines were placed in Schedule 2, high potential for abuse but still accepted medical uses. This meant they could still be prescribed, but with much stricter controls. Doctors had to use special prescription pads. Refills were limited. Pharmacies had to keep detailed records. And most importantly, the government imposed production quotas on pharmaceutical companies, drastically reducing the number of pills that could be legally manufactured. The impact was immediate. Prescription rates plummeted. The endless supply of diet pills and energy boosters dried up. Doctors, suddenly aware that they'd be scrutinized for their prescribing practices, became far more cautious. Patients who'd been taking amphetamines for years found themselves abruptly cut off, forced to navigate withdrawal with little support or guidance. Some succeeded in quitting, many didn't. The legal crackdown created an immediate vacuum, and the black market rushed to fill it. People who'd become dependent on prescription amphetamines didn't stop needing them just because their doctors wouldn't prescribe them anymore. They turned to illegal sources. Some pills were diverted from legitimate supplies, stolen from pharmacies, obtained through prescription fraud, or sold by doctors willing to break the rules. But increasingly, users turned to illicitly manufactured amphetamines, and eventually to methamphetamine. The FDA's intervention was necessary and long overdue, but it came after decades of damage had already been done. An entire generation had learned to rely on amphetamines as a crutch, a solution to every problem from weight gain to fatigue to boredom. Breaking that dependence wasn't as simple as passing a law. The physical addiction was bad enough, but the psychological dependence was worse. People had built their identities around being productive, energetic, thin, successful, and they'd achieved all of that with pills. Without the pills, who were they? Just tired, hungry, ordinary people struggling to keep up. That was a hard reality to accept. The Controlled Substances Act didn't end America's amphetamine problem, it just changed it. Legal pharmaceutical speed gave way to illegal street speed. Prescription pills gave way to methamphetamine cooked in clandestine labs. The drug remained the same, but the context shifted from medical to criminal. And for the people caught in between, for the millions who'd been prescribed these pills by trusted doctors and were now told they were addicts, The transition was brutal. They'd been failed by the medical system, failed by the pharmaceutical industry, and now they were being abandoned to figure out recovery on their own. Some made it. Many didn't. And the cycle of amphetamine abuse in America just kept spinning. When legal amphetamine supplies dried up, users didn't quit. They innovated. Enter methamphetamine, speed's bigger, badder cousin. Meth had been around since the 1930s, but it exploded in popularity in the 1980s and 90s, especially in rural America. Unlike pharmaceutical amphetamines, meth could be cooked in makeshift labs using over-the-counter ingredients. It was cheaper, stronger, and far more destructive. The high was more intense, the addiction faster, and the physical toll catastrophic. Meth didn't just ruin lives, it gutted entire communities, leaving behind a trail of broken families, crime, and despair. Methamphetamine had always been the more potent version of amphetamine, same basic chemical structure, just with an added methyl group that made it cross the blood-brain barrier more easily and hit harder. During World War II, both sides had used it. In post-war Japan, surplus military meth flooded the civilian market, creating an epidemic that took years to control. But in America, meth had remained relatively obscure, overshadowed by pharmaceutical amphetamines that were legal, standardized, and readily available. That changed in the 1970s and 80s when the legal supply tightened. Chemists, some with formal training, others just adventurous criminals, figured out how to synthesize methamphetamine using ephedrine or pseudoephedrine, compounds found in over-the-counter cold medicines. The synthesis wasn't complicated if you had basic chemistry knowledge. You could do it in a kitchen, a garage, a motel room, or a trailer. All you needed were the right chemicals, some glassware, a heat source, and a willingness to risk blowing yourself up or poisoning yourself with toxic fumes. The product was crude compared to pharmaceutical-grade amphetamines, but it worked. In fact, it worked too well. Methamphetamine was more potent than anything most users had experienced before. The high was euphoric, intensely pleasurable, accompanied by feelings of invincibility and clarity. Users felt like they could do anything, work for days without rest, solve complex problems, connect with others on a profound level. The initial experience was so positive that people convinced themselves they could control it, that they'd just use it occasionally, that they were different from the addicts they'd heard about. But methamphetamine is uniquely addictive. It releases massive amounts of dopamine, far more than natural rewards like food or sex, far more even than other drugs like cocaine. The brain's reward system gets hijacked completely. After that first high, nothing else feels good anymore. Food tastes bland, music sounds flat, relationships feel empty. The only thing that registers as pleasurable is more meth. And the tolerance builds quickly, meaning users need more and more to achieve the same effect, spiraling into addiction within weeks or even days of first use. The physical effects were horrifying. Meth users stopped eating and sleeping, their bodies consuming themselves. They lost dramatic amounts of weight, their faces becoming gaunt and skeletal, their teeth rotted, a condition called meth mouth caused by dry mouth, teeth grinding and neglect of basic hygiene. Their skin broke out in sores that they'd pick at obsessively, convinced there were bugs crawling underneath. They aged decades in just a few years. Before and after photos of meth users were shocking, almost unbelievable. The same person, transformed from healthy to hollowed out in the space of months. The psychological effects were equally devastating. Chronic meth use caused paranoia so severe that users barricaded themselves in their homes, convinced enemies were watching them. They experienced hallucinations, visual, auditory, tactile. Some developed full-blown psychosis that didn't resolve even after they stopped using. They became violent, unpredictable, dangerous to themselves and others. Families watched helplessly as their loved ones descended into madness, and it spread like wildfire through rural communities. Urban areas had established drug markets with multiple substances available. But in small towns and rural areas, especially in the Midwest, Southwest, and Pacific Northwest, meth became the drug of choice simply because it was there. It was cheap to make and therefore cheap to buy. For people living in economically depressed areas with limited opportunities, facing poverty and hopelessness, meth offered a temporary escape. It made you feel powerful, capable, alive, everything that reality denied you. But that temporary escape destroyed everything. Users couldn't hold jobs once addiction took hold. They stole from family and friends to fund their habits. Children were neglected or abused. Crime skyrocketed as desperate addicts broke into homes, cars and businesses, looking for anything they could sell. Meth labs contaminated properties, leaving behind toxic waste that made homes uninhabitable. Emergency rooms and jails overflowed. Small-town America, already struggling economically, was being gutted by a drug that was both a symptom of despair and a cause of it. Law enforcement tried to respond, but they were overwhelmed. For every meth lab they shut down, 3 more popped up. Arresting users didn't solve the problem. They'd just use again once they got out. Treatment options were limited and often ineffective. Methamphetamine addiction was so intense, the brain changes so profound, that recovery rates were dismally low. Many users relapsed repeatedly, unable to escape the drug's grip, even when they desperately wanted to. By the late 1990s, methamphetamine had become America's most destructive drug crisis. It wasn't concentrated in one area or one demographic. It affected rural farmers, suburban parents, urban workers, young people, old people, men, women, everyone. The rise of meth marked a turning point. Amphetamine use had moved from the socially acceptable realm of medical prescriptions into something darker, criminal, and seemingly unstoppable. And the worst part? It was still just getting started. Methamphetamine's rise wasn't accidental, it was organised. Outlaw motorcycle gangs, particularly the Hells Angels, became major players in meth production and distribution starting in the 1980s. They had the networks, the muscle, and the territory to control supply chains across the American West. Meth labs popped up in rural areas, warehouses, and even motel rooms, cooking batches of the drug in toxic, explosive conditions. The bikers didn't use it themselves, at least not all of them, but they knew a profitable market when they saw one. Meth was cheap to make, highly addictive, and generated enormous profits. It was the perfect illegal product, and for decades they ran the show. The relationship between outlaw motorcycle gangs and methamphetamine goes back to the 1960s, but it intensified dramatically in the 80s. These gangs, clubs like the Hells Angels, the Outlaws, the Bandidos, were already involved in various criminal enterprises: theft, extortion, gun running. But meth represented something different. It wasn't just profitable, it was scalable. Unlike marijuana or cocaine, which had to be grown or imported, meth could be manufactured domestically. You controlled the entire supply chain from production to distribution. The Hells Angels, in particular, became synonymous with meth production on the West Coast. They established networks of cooks, chemists with varying levels of expertise who set up labs in rural areas far from law enforcement attention. The rural West was perfect. Cheap land, sparse populations, and plenty of places to cook without being noticed. Remote cabins, abandoned barns, trailers in the middle of nowhere. These became meth factories churning out pounds of the drug every week. The production process was dangerous and toxic. Cooking meth produces noxious fumes, phosphine gas, and hydrous ammonia, ether that can kill you if you're not careful. Labs frequently exploded, incinerating everything and everyone inside. The chemicals contaminated soil and water. But for the gangs, these were acceptable risks. The profit margins were enormous. A few $100s in chemicals could produce thousands of dollars worth of meth. And the demand was insatiable. Distribution was handled through gang networks. Hells Angels chapters across California, Nevada, Arizona, and beyond served as distribution hubs. Members sold to dealers who sold to users. The gangs enforced their territories violently, making examples of anyone who tried to compete. Rival dealers were beaten, intimidated, or killed. The message was clear: this is our market, and we don't share. The gangs maintained a veneer of respectability, at least in some circles. They ran legitimate businesses, bars, tattoo parlors, motorcycle shops, that served as fronts for money laundering. They cultivated an outlaw image that some people found appealing, even romantic. But behind that image was a ruthlessly efficient criminal organization that was poisoning communities for profit. Law enforcement struggled to combat them. The gangs were insular and loyal, making it difficult to get informants. They used violence and intimidation to keep witnesses from testifying. Even when police managed to arrest members, new ones stepped in immediately to fill the void. Shutting down one lab just meant production shifted to another location. It was a game of whack-a-mole that law enforcement was losing. By the 1990s, the biker gangs' dominance began to fade. Not because they were defeated, but because they were outcompeted. Mexican drug cartels, seeing the profits available in methamphetamine, began establishing their own superlabs just across the border. These operations were larger, more sophisticated, and more efficient than the small-scale biker labs. They could produce meth in industrial quantities and smuggle it into the US with relative ease. The cartels had more resources, better organization, and access to purer chemicals, allowing them to produce a higher quality product at lower cost. The bikers couldn't compete with that. Gradually they lost market share. Some adapted, becoming distributors for cartel-produced meth rather than producing it themselves. Others moved into different criminal enterprises. But for a period spanning nearly 2 decades, outlaw motorcycle gangs were the face of American methamphetamine production. They turned speed into a cottage industry, spreading it across the country and embedding it deep into the fabric of rural and suburban life. The legacy of that era remains. Communities that were ravaged by biker gang distributed meth never fully recovered. Families torn apart by addiction still struggle. Properties contaminated by meth labs remain toxic and uninhabitable decades later. The gangs moved on, but the damage stayed behind, a permanent scar on the American landscape. By the 1990s, methamphetamine had a new name, crank, and it was everywhere. Small towns across the Midwest and South were drowning in it. Unlike cocaine, which was associated with cities and wealth, crank was the drug of rural poverty. It was cheap, accessible, and devastating. Users, often unemployed or underemployed workers, took it to stay awake, to work multiple jobs, or simply to escape the grinding monotony of economic despair. The social fabric unraveled. Crime spiked. Child protective services were overwhelmed. Families disintegrated. And in the middle of it all was a drug that had started as asthma medicine. The term crank supposedly originated from bikers who would hide methamphetamine in the crankcases of their motorcycles while transporting it. Whether that's true or apocryphal doesn't matter, the name stuck. By the early 90s, crank was the street name for methamphetamine, and it was synonymous with destruction. Small-town America in the 1990s was already struggling. Manufacturing jobs had disappeared, shipped overseas, or eliminated by automation. Family farms were failing, unable to compete with industrial agriculture. Main streets were dying, gutted by Walmart and chain stores. Young people were leaving for cities, seeking opportunities that didn't exist at home. What remained were communities hollowed out economically, with limited prospects and growing despair. Into this vacuum came crank. Meth promised energy and focus, exactly what struggling workers needed to get through multiple low-wage jobs. A single mother working 2 shifts could take crank and power through, staying awake and alert when her body was screaming for rest. A factory worker facing another decade of mind-numbing labour could take crank and feel like his life had meaning, at least temporarily. An unemployed man could take crank and feel productive, capable, valuable, feelings reality denied him. But the promise was a lie. The energy was borrowed, the focus unsustainable. Users would work for days straight, then crash for days, losing jobs they couldn't afford to lose. The drug didn't solve their problems, it created new, worse ones. And because meth is so addictive, people couldn't stop even when they realized what was happening. The impact on children was catastrophic. Parents addicted to crank neglected their kids, sometimes horrifically. Children went unfed, unwashed, unsupervised. Some were exposed to toxic chemicals from home meth labs. Others were sexually abused by parents whose inhibitions and judgment had been destroyed by the drug. Child protective services in states like Iowa, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Arkansas were overwhelmed, their caseloads doubling or tripling as the meth epidemic spread. Schools couldn't cope. Teachers reported students arriving hungry, tired, dirty, clearly living in chaotic homes. Some kids were essentially raising themselves, their parents too deep into addiction to function. The educational system, already underfunded in rural areas, had no resources to address the scale of the problem. A generation of children was growing up traumatized, and there was no help coming. Crime exploded. Meth users would steal anything to fund their habits: tools from garages, copper wire from abandoned buildings, prescription pads from doctors' offices, catalytic converters from parked cars. Burglaries became epidemic. Rural homeowners, once comfortable leaving doors unlocked, now lived in fear. Some took to patrolling their properties with guns, creating a vigilante atmosphere. Violence increased too. Meth makes people paranoid and aggressive, a dangerous combination. Domestic violence cases spiked. Bar fights became more common and more vicious. Meth-fueled road rage incidents made headlines, and the violence wasn't just between users and their families, it extended to law enforcement. Officers responding to domestic disturbances or attempting to arrest meth users faced suspects who were irrational, unpredictable, and capable of sudden extreme violence. Local law enforcement was overwhelmed and outmatched. Rural sheriff's departments were small, underfunded, and untrained in handling a drug epidemic of this scale. They could arrest users and dealers, but that didn't stop the flow. For every person arrested, 3 more took their place, and jails, already overcrowded, couldn't hold everyone. The criminal justice system became a revolving door: arrest, brief incarceration, release, immediate relapse, repeat. Treatment options were virtually non-existent in rural areas. Even if users wanted help, there were no rehab facilities within driving distance. The few programs that existed had waiting lists months long, and without support, without therapy, medical oversight, and a plan for rebuilding their lives, most users relapsed immediately upon leaving treatment. The cycle was vicious and seemingly unbreakable. Communities tried to respond. Churches organized intervention programs. Civic groups launched awareness campaigns. Local governments passed ordinances restricting the sale of cold medicines containing pseudoephedrine. But these efforts, while well-meaning, barely made a dent. The problem was too big, too entrenched, too connected to deeper issues of poverty and hopelessness that no local initiative could address. By the late 90s, entire regions were in crisis. The crank epidemic had turned parts of rural America into something resembling a war zone, communities under siege by a drug that was eating them from the inside out. And the worst part was the sense of abandonment. Urban drug crises got attention, funding, national concern. Rural meth? That was flyover country, someone else's problem, not worthy of the same response. So small towns struggled alone, and the drug kept spreading. As law enforcement cracked down on large-scale meth labs, manufacturers adapted. In the 2000s, a new method emerged: shake and bake, also called the one-pot method. It allowed people to cook meth in a single plastic bottle using cold medicine, lithium batteries, and household chemicals. It was fast, portable, and incredibly dangerous. The mixture could explode at any moment, causing severe burns or death. But for desperate addicts, it was a way to make their own supply without relying on dealers. Suddenly, meth production wasn't just in rural labs, it was in car trunks, motel bathrooms, and backpacks. The drug had become decentralized and nearly impossible to stop. The shake and bake method revolutionized, if that's the right word, meth production in America. Traditional meth labs required space, equipment, ventilation, and time. They were fixed locations that could be raided. The shake and bake method eliminated all of that. All you needed was a 2-litre soda bottle, some pseudoephedrine tablets, lithium strips from batteries, camp fuel or starter fluid, and a few other common chemicals. Mix them in the bottle, shake vigorously, let the chemical reaction happen, and within a few hours you had methamphetamine. The method originated, like many drug innovations, from necessity. As law enforcement became more sophisticated at detecting large meth labs, looking for bulk purchases of chemicals, monitoring suspicious activities in rural areas, producers needed a way to fly under the radar. The shake and bake method was that solution. It used small quantities of chemicals that could be bought from different stores without raising suspicion. It produced smaller batches, but you could make them anywhere, anytime. For users, this was transformative. Instead of relying on dealers and criminal networks, they could produce their own meth. An addict with a habit could become self-sufficient, at least temporarily. This appealed particularly to rural users in areas where distribution networks were less developed. Why wait for a dealer who might not show up when you could cook a batch yourself? But the shake and bake method was absurdly dangerous. The chemical reaction inside the bottle generates extreme pressure and heat. If you shake too hard, don't vent properly, or make any one of dozens of possible mistakes, the bottle explodes. And we're not talking about a small pop, we're talking about a violent explosion that sprays flaming chemicals across everything nearby. Users were regularly burned, sometimes horrifically. Emergency rooms began seeing patients with chemical burns covering their hands, arms, faces, injuries consistent with holding a bottle when it exploded. The fires were another problem. If the bottle exploded in a car, the vehicle would burst into flames. If it exploded in a motel room, the entire building could catch fire. First responders started encountering these situations regularly. Reports of car fires would turn out to be failed shake and bake attempts. Hotel managers found rooms destroyed, carpets and walls stained with chemical residue, the air still toxic days later. Law enforcement faced a nightmare scenario. How do you stop a crime that requires no fixed location, minimal equipment, and can be committed almost anywhere? Officers pulling someone over for a traffic violation might discover a shake-and-bake operation in progress on the passenger seat. The bottles were portable bombs, and handling them required specialized training. Entire police departments had to learn hazmat protocols just to deal with the epidemic of mobile meth production. The environmental contamination was staggering. Every shake-and-bake operation produced toxic waste, used bottles, contaminated clothing, chemical-soaked materials that users discarded wherever they happened to be. Roadsides became dumping grounds. Parks, rest stops, parking lots, anywhere people cooked meth became contaminated. Children playing in parks would occasionally find discarded meth cooking materials, not recognizing the danger. States tried to combat it by restricting sales of pseudoephedrine. Laws were passed requiring ID to purchase cold medicine, limiting quantities, creating databases to track purchases. Oregon and Mississippi went further, making pseudoephedrine prescription only. These measures helped, but determined users found workarounds. They'd recruit multiple people to buy small quantities, called smurfing, or they'd cross state lines to areas with looser restrictions. The illegal market for pseudoephedrine itself became lucrative, with people stealing it from stores or buying it in bulk to resell to meth cooks. The shake-and-bake phenomenon illustrated something disturbing. Addiction is incredibly adaptive. Every barrier placed in its way gets circumvented. Make large-scale production difficult, users will make small-scale production. Restrict ingredients, users will find substitutes or illegal sources. Increase enforcement, production will become more mobile, more hidden, more dangerous. The war on meth, like the war on drugs generally, became a perpetual game of cat and mouse, with the mouse always finding new ways to survive. And for the users themselves, shake and bake represented the final degradation. They weren't just buying drugs, they were risking death to make them, handling toxic chemicals in plastic bottles, one mistake away from being burned alive. It was desperation distilled into its purest, most dangerous form, and it showed no signs of slowing down. Let's jump back to the legal side. In the 1990s, pharmaceutical companies introduced a new player, Adderall, a combination of amphetamine salts marketed primarily for ADHD. It was a huge success. Millions of children and adults were prescribed it, and it genuinely helped many people focus and function. But it also became the new Benzedrine, a study drug, a productivity tool, a way to cram more hours into the day. College campuses were flooded with it. Students bought it from friends, crushed it, snorted it, or popped it before exams. It wasn't called speed, it was called medication. But chemically, it was the same thing. Adderall hit the market in 1996, just as the diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder was exploding. ADHD had been recognized for decades, but diagnostic criteria had been relatively narrow. In the 90s, that changed. The definition broadened. Suddenly, behaviors that might once have been dismissed as normal childhood energy or teenage distraction became symptoms of a disorder requiring treatment. And the treatment of choice? Stimulant medication, specifically Adderall. For kids who genuinely had ADHD, Adderall was often life-changing. They could sit still in class, focus on homework, control impulsive behaviors that had been making their lives and their families' lives miserable. The medication worked by increasing dopamine and norepinephrine in the brain, helping to regulate attention and impulse control. It was for many children exactly what they needed. But the prescription rates quickly outpaced what could reasonably be attributed to ADHD alone. By the early 2000s, millions of children were on Adderall or similar medications like Ritalin or Vyvanse. Some genuinely needed it. Others were prescribed it because parents or teachers wanted more manageable kids, because schools were under pressure to improve test scores, or because pharmaceutical marketing had convinced everyone that any attention problem was a medical issue requiring medication. And then there was the diversion. Kids with prescriptions quickly realized their pills had value. College-bound high school students would save pills to sell at university. College students with prescriptions became dealers, not because they were criminals, but because demand was enormous and supply was sitting in their medicine cabinets. A bottle of 30 Adderall pills, prescribed for about $20 with insurance, could be sold for $200 or $300 on campus. The demand came from students who felt overwhelmed by academic pressure. College in the 2000s wasn't just competitive, it was crushing. Students faced enormous tuition debt, pressure to maintain high GPAs for graduate school or jobs, and a culture that glorified overwork and productivity. Sleep became a luxury. Downtime became guilt. Everyone was grinding, hustling, optimizing, and Adderall seemed like the solution. Students without ADHD who took Adderall experienced exactly what speed users had always experienced: intense focus, heightened energy, ability to work for hours without fatigue, suppressed appetite, and a feeling of enhanced capability. They could write papers in single marathon sessions, study for exams all night, and still show up to morning classes alert. It felt like a competitive advantage, and in a zero-sum academic environment, advantages mattered. But it came with the same cost speed had always carried. Students developed tolerance, needing higher doses to achieve the same effect. They became psychologically dependent, convinced they couldn't perform without it. They experienced anxiety, insomnia, and paranoia. Some developed full-blown addictions, taking pills daily just to feel normal. The crash after multi-day study binges was devastating: depression, exhaustion, inability to concentrate without the drug. Universities knew what was happening but responded inconsistently. Some cracked down, treating Adderall distribution as drug dealing and expelling students caught selling their prescriptions. Others looked the other way, tacitly accepting that widespread stimulant use was just part of modern academic culture. Student health services were flooded with students seeking ADHD diagnoses, and some providers were remarkably generous with prescriptions, while others were more skeptical. The normalization was perhaps the most disturbing aspect. Taking Adderall to study wasn't considered drug abuse, it was considered smart strategy. Students who refused to use it were seen as naive, putting themselves at a disadvantage. The rhetoric around it was clinical and sanitized. I need to take my medication to focus. Even students who knew they didn't have ADHD would adopt this language, as if calling it medication made it less problematic than calling it what it actually was: amphetamine use for performance enhancement. Parents were complicit too. Some actively encouraged their children to get ADHD diagnoses before college, knowing the prescription would provide an academic edge. Others looked the other way when they found pills in their kids' belongings, rationalizing that at least it wasn't marijuana or alcohol. The drug was legal, prescribed by doctors, and associated with success rather than failure. What could be the harm? The pharmaceutical companies, meanwhile, were making billions. Adderall and its competitors became blockbuster drugs, with sales growing year after year. They marketed carefully, avoiding explicit encouragement of off-label use while creating messaging that positioned their drugs as keys to success, focus, and achievement. They funded patient advocacy groups, sponsored medical conferences, and supported research that emphasized the benefits of stimulant treatment while downplaying risks. By the 2010s, Adderall use had become so normalized that shortages became national news. When manufacturing issues or regulatory problems caused supply disruptions, students panicked. Online forums filled with desperate posts about where to find pills, how to ration supplies, or what alternatives might work. The dependency had become so widespread that a temporary shortage was treated as a crisis, Adderall Nation wasn't just about pills, it was about what the pills represented. A culture that valued productivity over health, achievement over well-being, and performance over authenticity. It was a society that had medicalized normal human limitations and turned them into problems requiring pharmaceutical solutions. And it was the next chapter in amphetamine's long, dark history of being repackaged, remarketed, and redistributed to a new generation that somehow believed this time would be different. By the 2000s, Adderall wasn't just widespread on college campuses, it was expected. Students who didn't use it felt like they were competing with one hand tied behind their backs. Everyone else was pulling all-nighters fueled by pills, so why shouldn't they? The pressure was immense. Adderall became an academic performance enhancer, traded like currency in dorm rooms and libraries. Some students had prescriptions, most didn't. And while they aced their exams, they also dealt with insomnia, anxiety, weight loss, and the creeping realization that they couldn't function without it. The arms race wasn't just about grades anymore, it was chemical. The metaphor of an arms race is apt because that's exactly what it felt like. Once a critical mass of students started using Adderall, everyone else felt compelled to follow. If your classmate was studying for 20 hours straight on Adderall, and you were studying for 8 hours without it, who was going to perform better on the exam? The calculus seemed simple, either level the playing field or fall behind. This created a feedback loop. As more students used Adderall, the baseline expectations for academic performance rose. Professors, noticing that students seemed capable of producing more work, assigned more work. Study groups expected everyone to contribute at levels that really only made sense if people were chemically enhanced. The bar kept rising, and students who wanted to stay competitive felt they had no choice but to use stimulants. The trading and selling became remarkably casual. During finals period, students with prescriptions could make serious money. A single 30-milligram pill might sell for $10 or $15. Some students financed their own prescriptions entirely by selling half their pills to classmates. Transactions happened openly in libraries, dorm common areas, even in classrooms before exams. It was treated less like drug dealing and more like sharing resources. The logistics were surprisingly organized. Some students maintained regular customer lists, texting their clients when they had pills available. Others used encrypted messaging apps or the dark web to facilitate larger sales. Payment apps made transactions easy. No need to exchange cash. Just Venmo your dealer with a pizza emoji in the memo line. The infrastructure of college drug dealing had been modernized and streamlined, but beneath the efficiency was a growing crisis. Students were developing genuine addictions to drugs they'd started taking just to get through finals. What began as occasional use, a pill here and there during exam periods, escalated into daily use. Students found they couldn't concentrate in lectures without Adderall. They couldn't start assignments without it. Eventually, they couldn't function at all without it. The psychological impact was severe. Many students developed profound anxiety, convinced they were intellectual frauds whose academic success depended entirely on pills. They questioned whether they'd actually learned anything, or whether their brains had just been chemically hijacked. Some experienced identity crises. Who were they without Adderall? Were they smart, capable people, or just drug users pretending to be? The physical toll was mounting too. Students on high doses of Adderall for extended periods developed cardiovascular problems, heart palpitations, high blood pressure, chest pain. These weren't uncommon. Some students ended up in emergency rooms convinced they were having heart attacks. A few actually were. There were deaths, though universities were often reluctant to acknowledge the role stimulant abuse played. Sleep deprivation compounded everything. Students on Adderall could stay awake for days, but that didn't mean they should. Extended sleep deprivation causes hallucinations, paranoia, impaired judgment and memory problems, essentially negating whatever academic benefits the drug might provide. Students would emerge from finals periods looking like zombies, having lost 10 or 15 pounds, unable to remember much of what they'd supposedly studied. The come down after heavy use was brutal. Students would crash for 12 or 16 hours, then wake up depressed, unable to feel pleasure or motivation. Everything seemed pointless and grey. Some developed suicidal ideation during these crashes. Student counselling centres reported spikes in mental health crises immediately following exam periods, though they didn't always connect it to widespread stimulant abuse. Academically, the arms race produced diminishing returns. When everyone is enhanced, no one is. The competitive advantage disappeared as soon as everyone started using. What remained were higher expectations, more work, greater stress, and a student body running on pharmaceutical fumes. GPA inflation became a problem. So many students were performing at artificially elevated levels that traditional grading scales became less meaningful. Some students tried to resist. They formed support groups, pledging to stay drug-free and succeed on their own merits. But the pressure was relentless. Watching your peers churn out work while you struggled with normal human limitations was demoralizing. Many eventually caved, telling themselves it would just be this once, just for this exam, just until the semester ended. But of course, it never stopped there. Universities were slow to respond effectively. Some implemented programs to educate students about the dangers of stimulant abuse, but these were often half-hearted efforts that students ignored. The fundamental problem, academic cultures that demanded superhuman performance, went unaddressed because addressing it would require systemic change. It was easier to blame individual students for making bad choices than to examine why those choices felt necessary. The Adderall arms race represented something darker than just drug use. It was a generation of young people being taught that their natural abilities were insufficient, that success required pharmaceutical assistance, that human limitations were problems to be chemically solved rather than accepted, and that lesson would follow them long after graduation into workplaces and careers where the expectation of constant enhanced productivity would only intensify. Speed's resurgence wasn't just happening in dorms, it was happening in offices, startups, and Silicon Valley boardrooms. In a culture that worships productivity, sleep is seen as weakness, and rest as laziness. Adderall and similar stimulants became tools for hustlers, entrepreneurs, and workaholics determined to outwork everyone else. They called it biohacking or optimizing performance. But really it was just speed with a LinkedIn profile. The crash, the addiction, the burnout, those were just costs of doing business, and nobody wanted to admit that the foundation of their success was a pill bottle. Silicon Valley in particular embraced stimulants with enthusiasm that bordered on religious fervor. The tech industry's culture was built on relentless work, disruption, and the belief that extraordinary success required extraordinary sacrifice. Sleep 4 hours a night, work weekends, launch products on impossible deadlines, outwork your competitors or get left behind. In this environment, anything that enhanced productivity wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated. Adderall became the entrepreneur's secret weapon. Startup founders bragged about coding for 48 hours straight, fueled by stimulants and ambition. Venture capitalists asked prospective investments if their teams were hungry enough, code for whether they were willing to destroy their health in pursuit of success. Tech workers in their 20s and 30s took Adderall to keep up with demanding schedules, convincing themselves it was no different from coffee, just more effective. The language around it was sanitized and aspirational. They weren't using drugs. They were optimizing their neurotransmitters. They weren't addicted. They were committed to excellence. They weren't experiencing side effects. They were pushing through temporary discomfort. The terminology created distance from the reality of what was happening. Widespread amphetamine use in an industry that prided itself on innovation and disruption. Biohacking culture took this even further. Influencers and self-help gurus promoted stimulants as part of comprehensive enhancement regimens. Take Adderall for focus, modafinil for wakefulness, various nootropics for cognition. Measure your productivity, track your output, quantify everything. The body wasn't a biological system with needs and limits. It was a machine to be optimized, a startup to be scaled. Conferences and networking events became marketplaces for prescription medications. Bathrooms at tech conferences saw as much pill swapping as cocaine use in nightclub bathrooms, just with different branding. People openly discussed their stacks, combinations of pharmaceuticals and supplements designed to maximize performance. FOMO intensified the behavior. If everyone else was enhancing, you couldn't afford not to. The results were predictable. Success stories proliferated, companies built, fortunes made, innovations achieved. But behind those successes were bodies breaking down and minds unraveling. Tech workers in their early 30s developed heart problems, typically seen in people twice their age. Depression and anxiety were epidemic. Burnout became so common it was just accepted as the price of ambition. Some companies tacitly encouraged stimulant use by creating work environments that practically required it. Unlimited vacation policies that no one used. Free meals so employees wouldn't leave the office. On-site gyms and nap pods that created the illusion of work-life balance, while actually enabling people to work even longer hours. The message was clear. We provide everything you need to never stop working. And if you need chemical assistance to meet that expectation, well, that's your personal choice. Investors became complicit. When evaluating startups, they looked for teams willing to go to extremes. Founders who bragged about never sleeping or working 100-hour weeks were seen as dedicated, not reckless. The industry rewarded self-destruction and called it passion. And because a few people achieved extraordinary success this way, everyone else felt compelled to try. The irony was thick. An industry built on disrupting old inefficient systems had created a culture that was destroying people just as efficiently as any factory sweatshop. The difference was that tech workers were paid well and told they were changing the world, so the exploitation felt aspirational rather than oppressive. But the outcome, health destroyed in service of someone else's profits, was fundamentally the same. Families suffered too. Partners and spouses watched their loved ones disappear into work, medicated into zombies who were physically present but mentally absent. Children grew up with parents who were always distracted, always working, always optimizing. Relationships crumbled under the weight of stimulant-fueled workaholism dressed up as ambition. And the culture showed no signs of slowing down. If anything, it intensified. The pandemic normalized remote work, blurring boundaries between work and home even further. Productivity tracking software turned every moment into measurable output. The pressure to perform constantly, to be always available, to produce more with less, only increased. And stimulants offered a solution, however temporary and destructive. What nobody wanted to acknowledge was that this wasn't sustainable. Bodies break down. Minds burn out. The chemical debt accumulated from years of amphetamine use eventually comes due, and the bill is steep. But in productivity culture, thinking about long-term consequences was itself seen as a weakness. The only timeline that mattered was now, this quarter, this product launch. Everything else could wait. Until it couldn't. Here's what speed actually does to your brain. It floods your system with dopamine, the neurotransmitter responsible for pleasure, reward, and motivation. Normally, dopamine is released in small amounts when you eat, sleep, or accomplish something. Amphetamines release a tsunami of it all at once. Your brain feels incredible, focused, energized. euphoric. But here's the problem. Your brain adapts. It starts producing less dopamine naturally because why bother when the pills do it for you? Soon, normal activities don't feel good anymore. You can't focus without the drug. You can't feel happy without it. You're not addicted because you're weak. You're addicted because your brain has been chemically rewired. Understanding addiction requires understanding how the brain's reward system works. Dopamine is the currency of motivation. When you do something beneficial, eat when hungry, sleep when tired, achieve a goal, your brain releases dopamine, creating a sense of satisfaction and pleasure. This reinforces the behavior, making you more likely to repeat it. It's how humans evolve to survive. Do beneficial things, feel good, do them again. Amphetamines hijack this system completely. Instead of the modest dopamine release you'd get from eating or accomplishing a task, amphetamines trigger a massive surge. We're talking about dopamine levels 10 or more times higher than natural rewards produce. Your brain is flooded with signals saying this is the best thing ever, this is more important than anything. The experience is so intensely pleasurable that your brain prioritizes it above everything else. But the brain is adaptive. When bombarded with excessive dopamine, it compensates by reducing the number of dopamine receptors and decreasing natural dopamine production. This is called downregulation, and it's the brain's attempt to maintain balance. The problem is that this adaptation happens relatively quickly with amphetamine use, sometimes within weeks. Once downregulation occurs, you're in trouble. Normal activities that used to feel good, spending time with friends, eating a favorite meal, pursuing hobbies, no longer trigger sufficient dopamine release to feel pleasurable. The receptors that would normally respond to those activities have been reduced or desensitized. Life becomes grey and flat. Nothing feels satisfying except the drug that caused the problem in the first place. This is why amphetamine addiction is so insidious. It's not just psychological dependence, though that's certainly part of it. It's neurological. Your brain has physically changed in response to the drug. The circuitry that governs motivation, pleasure, and reward has been fundamentally altered. You're not choosing to use, you're trying to feel normal in a brain that no longer functions normally without chemical assistance. Tolerance builds simultaneously. As your brain adapts to high dopamine levels, you need more of the drug to achieve the same effect. What started as 5 milligrams becomes 10, then 20, then 40. Users find themselves taking doses that would have been unthinkable when they started, and each increase accelerates the brain's adaptation, creating a vicious cycle. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and rational thought, is also affected. Chronic amphetamine use impairs this region, making it harder to resist cravings, assess consequences, or make rational decisions about drug use. This is why addicts continue using even when they desperately want to stop, even when they understand the harm they're causing. The part of the brain that would normally exercise control has been compromised. Withdrawal is brutal precisely because of these neurological changes. When someone stops using amphetamines, their brain is left in a depleted state. Dopamine production is suppressed, receptors are downregulated, and the brain can't generate pleasure or motivation naturally. The result is profound depression, exhaustion so severe that getting out of bed feels impossible, inability to feel pleasure, called anhedonia, and overwhelming cravings for the drug. This acute withdrawal phase can last days or weeks, but the brain's recovery takes much longer, months or even years. During this time, former users struggle with persistent depression, difficulty concentrating, and reduced ability to experience pleasure. Many relapse during this period simply because life without the drug feels unbearably empty, even though they're technically clean. Research has shown that some changes may be permanent, or at least very long-lasting. Heavy, prolonged amphetamine use can cause lasting alterations to brain structure and function. Imaging studies show reduced grey matter in regions involved in decision-making and emotional regulation. Some cognitive impairments persist years after cessation. This isn't a moral failure or weakness of character, it's neuroscience. Once the brain has been rewired by repeated amphetamine exposure, the person isn't the same. They're fighting against their own altered neurology every day. Understanding this is crucial because it shifts how we think about addiction from a moral judgment to a medical reality. The science also explains why addiction is so difficult to treat. You can't just tell someone to quit when their brain is chemically structured to prioritize the drug above all else. Effective treatment requires time for the brain to heal, support to survive the healing process, and often pharmaceutical interventions to manage symptoms during recovery. And even with all that, relapse rates remain high because the neurological vulnerability can persist for life. The tragedy of amphetamine addiction is that it's created by the drug's mechanism of action. The very thing that makes it effective as a medication or performance enhancer is also what makes it devastatingly addictive. There's no way to get the benefits without the risks, and every person who starts using convinced they'll be the exception, who stays in control, is gambling with neurology that doesn't care about intentions or willpower. The brain will adapt. The addiction will develop. The science is clear, even when the user's judgment is clouded. Amphetamines don't just mess with your brain, they wreck your body. Prolonged use raises your heart rate and blood pressure, putting immense strain on your cardiovascular system. Heart attacks, strokes, and arrhythmias are common among long-term users. Your appetite disappears, leading to severe weight loss and malnutrition. Your teeth rot because the drug dries out your mouth, and you stop caring about brushing them anyway. Your skin breaks out. You develop sores that won't heal, and you age rapidly. Sleep deprivation compounds everything: hallucinations, paranoia, psychosis. Your body isn't designed to run on fumes and chemicals indefinitely. Eventually it breaks, and when it does, it's not pretty. Let's start with the cardiovascular system, because that's where amphetamines cause the most immediate danger. These drugs are powerful stimulants. They increase heart rate significantly, sometimes to 120 or 130 beats per minute at rest. They constrict blood vessels, raising blood pressure to dangerous levels. For someone with undiagnosed heart problems or genetic vulnerabilities, even a single high dose can trigger a heart attack or stroke. Chronic use is even worse. Your heart isn't meant to race constantly. Over time, the sustained stress causes damage to the heart muscle itself. The left ventricle, the heart's main pumping chamber, can become enlarged and weakened, a condition called cardiomyopathy. This makes the heart less efficient at pumping blood, leading to heart failure. Many long-term amphetamine users develop this condition in their 30s or 40s, an age when it's otherwise rare. Arrhythmias are common too. The electrical system that regulates heartbeat gets disrupted by constant amphetamine exposure. Users experience irregular heartbeats, palpitations, or dangerous rhythms like ventricular tachycardia. Some die suddenly, their hearts simply stopping mid-rhythm. These deaths are often attributed to other causes: overdose, accident, unexplained cardiac event. But the underlying cause is years of amphetamine abuse. Blood vessels suffer as well. The constant constriction and elevated pressure damage arterial walls, accelerating atherosclerosis, hardening and narrowing of arteries. This increases the risk of heart attacks and strokes dramatically. Some users in their 20s have arterial systems that look like they belong to 60-year-olds. Then there's the weight loss. Amphetamines are powerful appetite suppressants. Food becomes uninteresting, even repulsive. Users forget to eat, or eat tiny amounts that don't come close to meeting their caloric needs. Combined with the increased energy expenditure from constant movement and elevated metabolism, this creates severe caloric deficits. The result is dramatic, sometimes shocking weight loss. Users can drop 30, 40, 50 pounds in just a few months. They become gaunt, skeletal, their faces hollowed out and bones protruding. But this isn't just aesthetic, it's dangerous. Malnutrition compromises every body system. Immune function drops, making users vulnerable to infections. Muscle tissue breaks down, including heart muscle. Bones become brittle from calcium deficiency. Vitamin and mineral deficiencies create cascading health problems. Anemia, neurological issues, poor wound healing, weakened bones, all consequences of not eating enough. Some users develop scurvy or pellagra, diseases of severe malnutrition that had nearly disappeared in developed countries. Their bodies are literally starving even as they insist they're not hungry. Dental problems are legendary among meth users in particular, but they affect amphetamine users generally. The term meth mouth describes the rapid, severe tooth decay that occurs. Multiple factors contribute. Dry mouth, stimulants reduce saliva production, and saliva protects teeth. Teeth grinding, bruxism common with stimulant use, neglect of oral hygiene, poor nutrition, and the acidic nature of the drugs themselves. The decay happens fast. Teeth crumble, turn black, fall out. Infections spread from decayed teeth into the jawbone, sometimes requiring surgical removal of large sections of jaw. The pain is excruciating, but users often ignore it, either because they're too high to care or too focused on getting more drugs. Emergency dental care is expensive and often inaccessible, so the decay progresses unchecked. Skin problems are another visible sign. Amphetamines cause vasoconstriction, narrowing of blood vessels, which reduces blood flow to the skin. This impairs healing and contributes to a greyish, unhealthy appearance. The skin loses elasticity and ages rapidly. Users develop wrinkles, sagging, and a weathered look that makes them appear decades older than their actual age. Then there's the picking. Stimulant-induced psychosis often includes tactile hallucinations, the sensation of bugs crawling under the skin. Users scratch and pick obsessively, creating sores and lesions. These wounds heal slowly because of the impaired circulation and malnutrition. They become infected easily. Some users pick so severely that they cause permanent scarring or disfigurement. Sleep deprivation multiplies all of this. Amphetamines can keep users awake for days or even weeks. The human body isn't designed for this. After about 3 days without sleep, hallucinations begin. Reality becomes unreliable. Visual, auditory, and tactile hallucinations are common. Paranoia intensifies. Some users become convinced they're being followed, watched, or targeted by conspiracies. The cognitive effects of sleep deprivation are severe. Memory fails. Decision-making becomes impaired. Motor skills deteriorate. Reaction times slow. Some users in this state make catastrophic decisions, driving while hallucinating, becoming violent, engaging in risky behaviors they'd normally avoid. And when they finally crash, they might sleep for 12 or 24 hours straight, their bodies desperately trying to recover. The immune system takes a beating too. Chronic stress from stimulant use, combined with malnutrition and sleep deprivation, suppresses immune function. Users get sick more often and more severely. Simple infections become serious. Some develop chronic conditions, pneumonia, abscesses, sepsis, that require hospitalization. For women, reproductive health suffers. Menstrual cycles become irregular or stop entirely. Fertility drops. Pregnant women using amphetamines face increased risks of miscarriage, premature birth, and birth defects. Babies born to users may have low birth weight, developmental issues, and neonatal abstinence syndrome, withdrawal symptoms from in utero exposure. The cumulative physical toll is staggering. Long-term amphetamine users look and function like people decades older. Their bodies are broken down, systems failing, appearance ravaged. Some die from the direct effects, heart attacks, strokes, overdoses. Others die from complications, infections, injuries sustained during psychotic episodes, suicide during crashes. The drug doesn't just shorten lives, it degrades the quality of whatever life remains. And for those who survive and eventually quit, the physical damage often persists for years or permanently. The body can heal, but some injuries never fully recover. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your comfortable bed, with your prescription medication safely regulated, and your morning coffee waiting to give you a gentle legal boost, maybe spare a thought for the century-and-a-half journey of amphetamines. From an obscure asthma remedy sitting forgotten on a laboratory shelf, to a drug that powered world wars, reshaped cultures, destroyed communities, and continues to fuel both legitimate medicine and devastating addiction. Think about the German soldiers marching through Europe on Pervitin, their humanity chemically stripped away. Think about the 1950s housewives smiling through their exhaustion, popping diet pills just to keep their kitchen sparkling. Think about the truckers hallucinating phantom hitchhikers on lonely highways, the mods dancing until dawn in their Purple Hearts, the college students convinced they can't succeed without pharmaceutical assistance, and the rural communities gutted by methamphetamine, their children growing up in the wreckage. Speed promised energy, focus, productivity, and control. It promised you could be better, faster, stronger, that you could transcend your human limitations and achieve greatness. And for a moment, for a few hours or days or weeks, it delivered. Until it didn't. Until the crash came. Until the addiction took hold. Until the promise revealed itself as a lie wrapped in chemical euphoria. What makes amphetamines so dangerous isn't just what they do to your body or your brain, it's how perfectly they fit into our cultural narratives about success. We live in a world that worships productivity, that treats rest as laziness and sleep as weakness, that demands we optimize every moment and maximize every opportunity. Speed offers a shortcut to meeting those impossible demands, and every generation rediscovers it, rebrands it, and convinces itself that this time will be different. But it's never different. The drug doesn't change, the neurochemistry doesn't change, the addiction doesn't change. Only the packaging changes and the excuses and the language we use to pretend we're not making the same mistakes our grandparents made. The irony is bitter. A drug synthesized to help people breathe easier became something that suffocates lives, communities, and futures. The asthma medicine became the army's secret weapon, became the housewife's helper, became the trucker's co-pilot, became the student's study aid, became the entrepreneur's performance enhancer, became the epidemic that won't end. And perhaps the saddest part is how many people suffering from amphetamine addiction genuinely believed they were making responsible choices. They were following doctors' orders. They were meeting society's expectations. They were doing what it took to succeed. They were optimizing their performance. They were just trying to keep up. And somewhere along the way, the tool became the master, the helper became the destroyer, and the temporary boost became a permanent trap. So be grateful tonight. Grateful for regulations that came too late but still came. Grateful for the knowledge we've accumulated about addiction, even if we don't always use it wisely. Grateful for treatment options, however imperfect. Grateful for the second chances some people get and others never do. Be grateful that we understand now, better than previous generations did, that human limitations aren't flaws to be chemically corrected, but boundaries to be respected. And if you're listening to this while struggling with amphetamines yourself, whether prescription or otherwise, know this. You're not weak. You're not a failure. You're caught in a trap that was set long before you were born by pharmaceutical companies that prioritized profit over safety, by cultural narratives that value productivity over humanity, and by a drug that rewires brains with ruthless efficiency. Recovery is possible, even if it doesn't feel that way right now. The brain can heal. Life can feel good again without chemical assistance. It takes time and support and patience, but the prison has doors, even if they're hard to find. For everyone else, tonight's story is a warning wrapped in history. Every pill that promises to make you better, faster, more capable. Every chemical solution to human limitation comes with a cost. Sometimes that cost is acceptable. Sometimes it's necessary. But sometimes it's far steeper than anyone admits until it's too late. Speed isn't just history's most recycled drug. It's history's most seductive lie, told and retold to every generation with just enough changes to make it seem new. We keep falling for it because we want to believe that we can have it all, the energy, the focus, the success, without paying the price. But the price is always there, accumulating silently in neurons and synapses, waiting to be paid. So tonight, let that knowledge settle over you like a blanket. Let it weigh on you gently. Let it remind you that you are enough, exactly as you are, without chemical enhancement. Your natural energy, your normal attention span, your human need for rest and food and sleep, these aren't weaknesses. They're what make you human. And humanity, for all its limitations and imperfections, has always been enough to do extraordinary things. We just have to stop letting pills convince us otherwise. Sleep well. Rest deeply. And when you wake up tomorrow, maybe feel grateful for the simple miracle of consciousness without chemistry, of a mind that's entirely your own, and a body that knows when to push and when to rest. Because that balance, that natural rhythm, that's not a limitation, that's freedom. Good night.